Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Progressive American. I'm sitting here with Jody from Imperial News, a friend of the show. Welcome back, Jody. How you doing?
Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm super tired. I'm just warning up front. Tired.
Yeah. No, I know exactly how you feel. It's just trying to balance all these things, and it can get overwhelming at times. So, this episode is more of me trying to catch up on what has been happening with the Canadian convoy. Unfortunately, we also have our own, although it's not nearly as organized as the Canadian one, which is, I guess the Canadians did it better the first time.
Better is a relative term.
Relative term for the right wing, right?
Yeah.
I guess what I kind of wanted to go over first off was what was your first reaction to this? Because when I first saw this, it looked like just out of the blue.
Yeah. In a weird way, like I cover this stuff, but it still kind of felt out of the blue. And what I mean by that is like normally, so on our podcast, we cover Rebel News, which
Yes.
is a far right media outlet in Canada. And so if something is happening on the right, that is usually the lens that I get it from. And so it was the Friday before the weekend in which they began the convoy was the first time we heard about it on the show because Ezra Levant, the main guy, he sent one of their employees named Mocha Bazurgan to ride the trucker convoy from starting in Vancouver, and they were going to go all the way to Ottawa. So the west coast to Ottawa, the capital. And so he was like, we're embedding Mocha. And that was kind of like, I had heard whispers before then because like I also follow and read a lot of the anti-fascists in Canada who track a lot of this stuff. So it was on my radar that something was happening. I just didn't think it was that big. And my reason for not thinking it was that big was we had this thing. Do you remember the yellow vest movement in
Yes.
France? Les
Yes.
Gilets jaunes, as try to get some better French here. That was a movement in France that had to do with gas prices increasing, and so then you had a lot of machine operators, taxis, this kind of thing, rise up angry at the government for increasing the taxes on their gas, right? And so, and the interesting thing about that movement was that it wasn't just like right wing. It was a mishmash. It was left and right. It was like, in some sense, a general like workers' rights kind of movement. There was even fighting in the streets between left-wing yellow vests and right-wing yellow vests. You know what I mean? So like they were both on agreement. They just, in terms of like the immediate thing, but still hated each other. Right? But anyways, this got sort of like co-opted in Canada for whatever reason. I don't know what it was, but we had a bunch of people dressing up in yellow vests in Canada, even though we didn't have a similar thing. And they had vague sort of like demands. So their thing was like carbon tax is bad, but then also it sort of brought in this like Sharia law is bad, which seems kind of like
Unrelated.
And so all of a sudden, every weekend, so even locally, so I live in London, Ontario, which is there's roughly 500,000 people here. We would have every weekend, maybe like 4 or 5 people all wearing yellow vests, standing outside of our city hall, demanding that Sharia law end and to remove the carbon tax. and and actually at these protests,
you cut out for a bit there.
Oh, sorry. So we would see them outside of City Hall.
You cut out there from.
Is that pretty much where I cut out? Oh, yeah. So they would stand outside City Hall and they would, be mad at carbon tax and be mad at Sharia law. And then this is the first time actually that I saw QAnon enter Canada, because a lot of these yellow vesters would hold like QAnon signs. And and so this was a while, like this must have been, I can't remember, like 2017, 2018. I can't remember exactly when this was all happening. But that was also the first time that I ever saw QAnon in Canada, in the Canadian context, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then, so they went from this to doing this thing that was called United We Roll. And it was a similar idea to the truck thing that we had recently about the mandates, except United Re-Roll. The idea was they were going to like wheel up to the Capitol and do the exact same thing, but for the Sharia law gas stuff. That's because COVID wasn't a thing at this point. And it kind of failed. It kind of like sucked as a thing. They went, did it. There was maybe a couple hundred of them and like nothing happened. Right.
Mm.
And some of the people involved in that convoy, such as a dude named Pat King, were involved in this convoy. Okay. So when they started doing the ramping up beforehand, I was just like, it's probably going to be United We Roll #2, and nothing is going to happen, right?
That age like bad milk.
Yeah. Well, I started realizing that something was going to happen once Ezra was like, we're embedding one of our reporters in it, and that's when I started to like, okay, something's going on here. And then you could even tell the build up beforehand, like United We Roll got like no coverage whatsoever. No one talked about it. No one showed up for it. So like the interesting thing about this convoy was as they were going from, there's 2 transport routes, one from west and one from the east, and all with the idea of meeting in our capital, which is not quite the center of Canada, but like maybe off center. And there was a lot of, I say a lot, it's hard to gauge how many people they were, but there was at least people along the way, with their signs like, end the mandates now. And so a lot of that was happening as they were like crossing the country, right? Where they would like stand on the overpasses on the main highway and support the truckers as they were coming through. So it was like, even watching that happened because like they took a week to get from the coasts to get to the capital. So they left the one weekend on they left the weekend before January 29th to arrive in Ottawa on January 29th. And that was when the first day of the occupation of Ottawa happened.
It's just surreal watching it, because initially when I heard about this convoy, my attitude was, okay, looks like many countries, people are struggling to deal with the reality that pandemics tend to reveal, which is we are not 100% in control of the reality in which we live. But then I started noticing a lot of the talking points that were very similar to the American right, and of course the underlying use of prejudice as well, because the People's Party of Canada is involved. And so from my perspective, I was like, oh, this is a Canadian thing, and I was like, oh no, this involves us as well. Moda, I know I'm not live on YouTube. I can't change it right now. I don't want to just mess up the entire thing. I'll upload it. So like from your perspective, how did you view the way in which American political discourse and Canadian political discourse intersected in this occupation, if you want to put it that way?
I have a bit of like a bugbear in that I get frustrated when people try to think of like Canada and America in somewhat like separate entities. I've long since like the problem is like we're so culturally similar. We share a lot of the same media, and we're both colonizers. There's a shared lineage there. I mean, there's subtle differences, but I think largely they just get like washed out in that like, we have our right wing, and our right wing is just as tapped into your right wing's media. And they cross-pollinate too. Like Ezra's been on Tucker Carlson before, so Ezra went on the Tucker during the trucker thing as well. But like he had been on there before, so this isn't a unique thing in that sense. But it is. I don't know. Like I don't think of them as largely separate entities. I guess like the only difference is in the Canadian context, they had specific ideas of what they wanted to accomplish in the Canadian context. So a lot of the truckers were going to do, and I call them truckers because we can get to what extent they are or are not in fact truckers. But like they had this plan, which was to, I guess we have this figure in our government called the Governor General. And the Governor General is supposed to be sort of like our representation of the monarchy. Okay, so it's the Queen's representation to our government. Okay, and it's largely a symbolic role. She like the Governor General has done things lately in like the past 10 years that has made people even less susceptible or less amenable to the idea that we have this role in terms of what's called proroguing Parliament. And we don't have to get into that. Either way, there's some tension there. But their idea, the truckers' idea, was that they were going to sign this document and present it to the Governor General and get her to like force Trudeau to resign. Right? So they were basically going to ask the monarchy to dissolve Parliament.
That is like the weirdest thing, because if there's any, like, it's weird, they call themselves like the Freedom Convoy, for example, and yet here they are using
Freedom,
an
save us,
outdated
monarchy.
the monarchy that doesn't really have any influence on Canada anymore to force a duly elected executive to resign. That is just perfect.
And the other thing is, like, we just had an election. Like, our last election was 2000. It literally, like, we literally just had it. So it's like our voters decided already. Like, I don't know what they wanted. It's like, even though you voted, we're still going to ask the monarchy to dissolve you.
And that's something that I feel like is like, back to your point about how America's right and Canada's right are not that different in certain elements, because even when, say, for example, in 2020, when Biden defeated Trump, there was this element of like, no, this is not how the election is supposed to go. There's not an acceptance of the process, and and they're willing to use any tactics necessary to usurp that process, so long as there aren't any severe consequences for them. But
the one subtle difference in our context is that we didn't have like a Trump figure telling people that like the election was rigged, right?
Yes.
So they really were a bunch of fringe people wanting to do this weird maneuver that doesn't even exist anyways. And they weren't even really, like, some of them were claiming voter fraud. I mean, of course they would, because of this cross-pollination with like American stuff. But like, it wasn't their primary message. It was like, it had nothing to do with voter fraud. It was that Trudeau was illegitimate because he's tyrannical because of all the COVID mandates. And that's why we need the monarchy to save us.
It's just fascinating to see like the conspiracism, because like, and I bring this up again and again because the way I see it right now is this convoy is on the down low. Now it's starting to decline, at least in Canada, but like, there are pockets that remain. And yet it's kind of become this mythologized symbol, similar to what you described with the yellow vests, where they use the symbol of the yellow vests in Canada for their own purposes outside of their context. And when I'm looking in the United States and there is this convoy that's trying to do the exact same thing, I do wonder if ever, like, there will be a similar attempt to recreate these movements, not just like in convoys and things like that, but other forms of obstruction of entire cities, like what happened in Ottawa.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, I find largely that they've taken these ideas from the left already. So like, in the Canadian context, we had, well, for one, there was the Occupy movement, which predates a lot of this, right? So, and that was largely a left-wing movement, although it was a lot more wider tent, like broader tent, in that you had a lot of libertarians who were pro-Occupy Wall Street as well, right? But in Canada, we also just recently, right before the pandemic, had a sort of like cross-country solidarity blockade for a lot of our rail infrastructure, having to do with the RCMP invading Wet'suwet'en territory. So for those who don't know, there's an Indigenous group in northern British Columbia on their land. It was never like ceded to Canada, so it's their land. And our government has decided they want to put a pipeline through it. And they've been violently fighting with them since. And so the rest of Canada, like, it got to a point where they were basically storming in there with guns, and a lot of activists across Canada, in solidarity with them, like, blocked rail infrastructure. And so, like, my point is that like similar things were done to block things, and granted, in the case of the Wet'suwet'en, I think that was a legitimate cause. I participated in my local rail blockade. It didn't last very long, but in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, we participated in it, right? Like civil disobedience is a good tool, and like it should be utilized. Like I have no problem with the tactic of occupation itself. The problem is like their goals were largely incoherent. and I don't agree with them, and they're fascists, let's just be real.
And like I agree, like there's this, for me it's like something along the lines of, yes, civil disobedience is a key component of legitimate movements seeking to improve the lives of their fellow human beings. What concerns me is that with the so-called Freedom Convoy and the American right, is that there is this underlying conspiracism and fear. Like, for example, Benjamin Dichter was one of the spokespersons initially, or at least how the media portrayed him, for this convoy, and he has a history of constantly complaining about Islam and saying like Canada is being Islamified. And so it's like worrying that if like the American right or the Canadian right were to somehow use the connections they have already through media and whatnot to organize something bigger than this, what would be the proper, at least what would in theory be the proper response to prevent them from, say, trying to force the government to pass racist laws or something along those lines?
Well, I mean, we have to fight them. I mean, that's
yeah.
Thing is, and you can't rely, like, what the one lesson to take away from what happened in Canada is you can't rely on the police to do anything about it either. Like that was one of the reasons why, like, a lot of people speculate why Trudeau implemented what was called like the Emergency Act. And the only thing I could think of, because like some people say that he did it so that he could freeze some of the truckers' assets, but we have laws in Canada which they could have froze the assets of them because they were breaking the law. Like we have laws that allow them to do that. Like you don't need to enact emergency measures to do that. And so like what I suspect was done in order, like why they implemented the Emergency Act, was because the police were not doing their job. And this gave them extra authority to control the police, to actually get them to do what they should have been doing in the first place, should have been doing in the terms of like what are in police's job description, of course, the police forces tend to be white supremacist in nature and are way more likely to storm an indigenous community with their guns blazing and then treat a bunch of white fascist truckers with kids gloves. But like, that's the thing. We have to realize that and know that the one thing that I will highlight, there was one good incident that occurred in which a community, I think it was Billingsbridge, could be Billingsbridge. It was like an off ramp onto one of the main highways, and a bunch.
Was it when they like? Was that the one where they all just lined up and blocked the truckers from even getting into their community?
So they blocked a bunch of truckers from getting in, and then what they did was they went truck by truck and said the only reason we're going to let you leave is if you remove all the flags and like bumper stickers that are like pro convoy and stuff like this. Remove all of that symbolism from your vehicles and turn around and leave. Otherwise, we're going to stay here forever. And so there's like great video footage of watching like these sad, dejected truckers removing decals from their from their trucks, and no violence had. Like it was organized completely by the community. They got it done, and no violence broke out. And like those kinds of actions are like, I think, the more inspiring nature of what can be done about this, because otherwise, like, fascism is going to keep growing. The only other thing that I can suggest we do is build community and make society better. Like, it's not going to remove fascism completely, but if you can moderate it by making people at least somewhat happy, they don't have to be afraid of imaginary enemies. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think the best way to put that is, at least in my opinion, is like the proper response to civil disobedience is your own civil disobedience, blocking them, preventing them from being able to operate. And
even
it's good to
becomes
see,
like against the law. Like we had local rallies in London blocking the trucker convoys, and then the police would remove the people blocking the trucker convoys rather than the truckers. So it all sucks.
Yeah, it's very, very like weird because like I also remember reading that there were officers who are currently being investigated for their sympathies for the convoy, even though many of these convoy participants engaged in harassment, violence, and allegedly attempted to burn down an apartment building with people inside.
Yep.
And it just
We still don't know the details on that one, but kind of frightening. Yeah.
well, and that's the other thing. Like I say it's ongoing, and it's like it's on the down low. But the only thing that is really on the down low is the actual convoy itself, not the people involved. Some of them have been arrested, and a lot of them are going to face a lot of punishment for this. But the fact of the matter
Maybe.
remains, maybe depends on how pissed off the government is.
Like courts, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I feel somewhat the same way with the January 6th insurrection. We've been waiting for a while to see some punishment, and only recently have we seen some conspiracy charges.
Your boy Enrico recently got a. I don't know if you followed that. Enrique Terrio, who's the the leader of the Proud Boys now. He was just recently indicted, so that's I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, that was nice to see. It was one of those things where it's like, finally they got at least one of these guys. But it just like seeing the police going to that point of the police not doing things and the Emergency Act allegedly compelling them to act. Do you think that like the Canadian government, well, I can guess your answer, but the Canadian government will see this as a sort of a wake-up call about the nature of the police in Canada, or do you see that this could be used as a symbol by activists to push the issue?
No, I think there's more of that happening in Ottawa itself. Horizon Ottawa is a group that's been doing some good work fighting the police budgets and stuff like this. I don't think that's going to come out of the federal government at all. I mean, they've spun it as like, thankfully the police did their job when they finally went in there. And like, yeah, here's the thing is I didn't even like when they came in because a few of the trucker people, got trampled by horses and like pepper sprayed and beaten with sticks. And like, I don't think state violence is good, even if it is for a bunch of people I disagree with who are occupying city streets, or not just disagree with, fascists occupying city streets. State violence is not the answer. I don't think, or at least like I worry of the further potential to radicalize people when you have the like police come in there, as they would describe them, jackbooted thugs, to then like beat them. That like might further radicalize them.
Yeah, and it's good propaganda. You've got images of what you can portray as peaceful protesters demanding their rights and so on, and then you show the police on a horse or whatever coming over and trampling people, and that's the other thing, like the mythology. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say one of Rebel's reporters named Alexa Lavoie, she was shot. Well, she was pepper sprayed and hit with a stick. From my knowledge, they claim that the police shot her with a tear gas canister. As far as I know, no tear gas itself was deployed, but they claim she was shot with a tear gas canister. And so Ezra keeps on saying like, Alexa was shot by the police. And like keeps like selling it like we're such victims, like the government specifically targeted us with this tear gas. Meanwhile, it's like, why did you have your reporter at the front of the line without wearing any safety equipment, you idiots?
Well, yeah, like there are reporters who fundamentally will like who actually know what they're doing and know there's a risk of getting hit just in confusion. And they prepare for it. So it's really, really weird when they do that. But then again, I'm not surprised by that a publication like Rebel, which constantly uses the video of David Menzies and his Scotch arc.
Well, that's the thing. It's the right-wing grifting machine. It's like antagonize, wait for the police to attack, and then monetize off of it by looking, oh, look, we're the victims. That's the thing.
Oh yeah, it's just like I'm not touching you, and then when they smack you when you get smacked upside the head, cry that you got smacked upside the head.
Yes, they're children.
No, like, oh yeah. I mean, they it's just so odd because you know what they're doing, but it's also like so childish that like, and it works. That's the thing that really drives me nuts. It works. It's
Yeah.
just
Well, I think that like feeds into the. I find a lot of this like frustrating. Like even the trucker thing itself is frustrating and childish. But like that's why it's I I kept on having to fight people because I think like the framing of who these truckers were was like really frustrating. In terms of like, oh, they're the working class, or they have real working class like grievances, right? That was like, even you saw like Tucker Carlson, which always is trying to like latch onto this populist message about like
mhm.
we got to appeal to the white working class, you know. And when you actually try to get to understand who these people were, like, of course, there's going to be some working class people within this convoy. There's even going to be some truckers. Like, you know, these groups are not monoliths. So some of these people exist. But most of the people there were people who could afford to be there. They were small business owners. They were the people who are not upset about like working conditions. They're upset because you don't you just remember a society where no one wore masks and we could see each other's faces and I could yell at a Walmart employee without like with seeing their face? Like those are the things with what they want. They don't like the fact that society has even subtly changed and it makes them feel uncomfortable. uh those are the people who are out there in the trucks honking nonstop. You know, uh it's not a working class movement at all.
Well, and the other thing, and you've mentioned this before, but it's very much a play on aesthetics. These aren't people who are like living paycheck to paycheck or anything. These are people who could afford to stay off of work for a week or more in a truck that they could rent and then just drive it halfway across the country to the capital of a major nation. And that's
And the
just,
people donating to they had like a give send. Well, the first they had a GoFundMe, it got canceled. They then had this like Christian version of it called Give Send Go. Those like
yep.
funds got up like prevented as well. But all like they were getting huge chunks of donations. Like there was some dude in America who donated $90,000 to the convoy money.
Yeah.
Like these are people with wealth. It was not like, I don't know, like it's so amazing that for a lot of people it got interpreted as like we have to understand the working class and their grievances. Like you saw that with like Richard Wolff and a bunch Jimmy Dore, of course, and Tucker
Oh,
Carlson.
Jimmy
Like they were
Dore.
all doing this shit. Yeah.
Jimmy Dore is always interesting, but it's fascinating because all I see when you were mentioning this and when you were kind of running me through this in Discord when we were talking about kind of these organizations and who's helping support them, it was just, I will say it was remarkably American. It was very AstroTurf. It reminded me of the Tea Party because it was this appeal to this idea of like the rugged white working class. And there wasn't a lot of actually acknowledging, no, these guys aren't representative of what the working class in this country looks like. I say it over and over again because it seems to me that there is this almost incestuous relationship between the American right and the Canadian right, and talking points and ideas and ways in which to cause as much trouble as possible are fed back and forth in a loop and exacerbate one another. And I know you've been trying to kind of comment on and push back on that, but I do sometimes wonder what would be, say, the government's response to something like, say, Ken Paxton from Texas going crazy and saying like, we got to support these people, they are fighting for their freedom, or Candace Owens talking about liberating Canada and sending in the US Marines or something like that.
I mean, like there's almost nothing you can't like. Again, like the solutions are going to come more from like from dealing. I don't know, like changing the culture of like this, and part of that comes with like changing people's material conditions. Like I think it's like a one, like you have to do both of that. But like I don't know. I don't think you can. Of course, the right wing is going to do that. I mean, like part of the right wing's project is to like they need to steal away these working class people. So of course, like part of their pitch is to do this song and dance about how like these truckers are the real working class, right? But like the thing about the truckers being the real working class is look at how they describe this group. They describe them as like, they're out there getting their hands dirty. They're people driving trucks. They wear their overalls and their plaid shirts and their straw hat. Like it's like a mythical conception. But like when you think of like who is the working class today, it's not, oddly enough, it's not truckers. It's people working at a Walmart. It's people working at a fast food restaurant that are getting the lowest wages and are like not unionized and like struggling, I mean, there's some truckers who are struggling. I don't want to like denigrate all that, but it's like the perception is that you're only working class if you're someone who's like working construction or something like this. Like that is, and what does that feed into? That feeds into our like cultural notions of like what being a man is. It's about being a man, and like that's what it is. It's all fields, It's
You're only a man if you break your back doing labor on a construction site that you don't want to be on and hate your job and just and drink whiskey on a Saturday evening or something like that. But no, like it's weird. Like I say this over and over again because watching this feels like every single major rhetorical trick of the right mixed together into a single event. And all I can say is that like this is kind of the product of an increasingly reactionary media environment, both here in the United States and in Canada. And it's like, it seems to me that the only real way to push back on that is an alternative, like an increasingly confrontational, fact-based, not conspiracy-based, left-wing media environment that can not only call out this stuff, but actually like reach out to people before they get radicalized by this kind of commentary.
See, this is my controversial take. I think that's one part of it. Obviously, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing with our show if I didn't think what you just mentioned is part of what's going on or what we should do, kind of thing. But the other thing and this is here's the thing. I'll even throw a bone to my liberal friends, even though I'm not a supporter of liberals, let alone the Liberal Party of Canada. But they were initiating legislation to curb online hate speech in our country. And I think the legislation, like, it wasn't the kind of legislation that I would want necessarily, but it was heading in the right direction. Because I think the one thing that people don't think about, I mean, part of why you have this growing fascist movement now as opposed to any other time is also the fact that we're so connected with social media and that these people have a place to go and meet other fascists and they're not afraid online because you can be anonymous, et cetera, right? So
Yep.
there's ways in which these people have these communities and can grow, where it's like if we had more regulation to stop that. And of course, then the flip side is you have, and this is especially true in America, where like everyone starts yelling freedom and free speech and free, we need to be free, don't tread on me, all that shit, right? But it's like at the end of the day, it's about harm and about like doing that kind of like calculus in terms of like take the Milo Yiannopoulos thing. I think this gets used as like a great example all the time. Do you hear about him anymore?
No.
He got like effectively removed from everything. And now we don't have to hear about him anymore. I mean, very rarely and often to make fun of him. But because he's been so limited, he's not as good as recruiting people to join him. There's not as many people listening to him. And that is an overall good for society. So it's like if we could find a way to make it harder for people to listen to things like Rebel News or InfoWars or Tucker Carlson, those would all be good things, in my opinion. And we should be doing stuff like that and deplatforming people. But of course, then you have all the center type people who are like, we need to have a marketplace of ideas. And I'm like, no, I'm against it. No marketplace of ideas for me.
See, like, my attitude is twofold. Like, yes, I think we absolutely need to make it harder for this kind of commentary to spread, particularly when like algorithms on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter kind of incentivize it. But I also do think that there needs to be something about media transparency. Like here in the United States, media consolidation and who funds media outlets is a matter of intense debate. And it's a problem because, for example, the Chicago Tribune, which is the paper I used to read, because it was an opposition, it was more of like a moderate conservative paper, and I live in Illinois, so I have to to get an understanding of what my government does wrong, I have to read an opposition newspaper. But unfortunately, it was bought up. The parent company was bought up by Alden Global Capital, which is one of the worst private equity firms for media newspapers. Like print is in decline, but Alden Capital is killing it. So to me, when I see something like, at least in the United States, there also needs to be an honest discussion about how consolidated modern media is and how it needs to be broken up and diversify. And at the same time, there needs to be, at least in the case of Rebel News, a legal requirement that they tell who their donors are. Not just anonymously, not this kind of nonsense. If they want to talk about the marketplace of ideas, if they want to talk about informing the citizenry, let's treat it like the public service that it should actually be.
Yeah, no, I'm down for that. I mean, like the last time they had anything leak, it was largely Coke funded, so it likely still is, but I don't know. You know that you're. I mean, this is also how why our media spheres are cross pollinated like this. Like Coke Industries is international.
It is an international business of nonsense and dangerous propaganda. And it was the same thing, I think, with the Daily Wire, too, with the Wilkes brothers. When they were initially started being founded, they were heavily funded by the Wilkes brothers. And so for me,
and the Mercers,
the Mercers, the Rowners were involved in that. Former governor of Illinois was actually involved in all of that. And he's got his cushy little job, too. So there's also, and that's another thing, there's an intersection between former government officials, at least in the United States. I don't quite know if it's the same in Canada, from these people who have a lot of money and they go into these like comfy jobs once they leave office. They then use that money, which they got from their experience in being in government, to fund their political projects, which in turn creates an entirely new media environment that's hyper partisan, hyper far right, and aggressive, and just ruins the entire media landscape until we have far less informed citizens and just things like this.
Yep, we got that same wheeling and dealing here. I mean, like, I'll say on top of what you're doing, because like this is a recent topic of conversation in terms of like, you know, blocking the resources of like Russian oligarchs. And I say we need to block the resources of our media oligarchs and steal their yachts as well. So that's
Yep. Well, I just who was it that had the yacht that was called Fountainhead? Was it Mark Cuban?
Oh my god, I don't know, but like I know immediately you're making an Ayn Rand reference. Dear Lord. You like the one aspect of this that we haven't touched on yet that I also think is one of the more like, oddly enough, hasn't gotten a lot, at least not from my perspective, a lot of attention, which is that in a way, again, similar to January 6th, was one of the blockades was in Coutts, Alberta, which I guess there's a border to Wisconsin, and some truckers like blocked that, preventing transport of goods like across. There was also like a bridge in Ontario and like several other places, but the Coutts one was like a bit more of like long lasting. And one of the things that came out of that was there was an arrest of about 14 individuals.
And they all had guns.
Along with a huge cache of guns. It wasn't just a cache of guns. They had like tactical vests with like neo-Nazi symbols and again, anti-Islamic symbols. And so not only that, so they were arrested, and it's starting to come out that like the charge was a conspiracy to commit murder. Like 4 of them, I think, were specifically charged with that one. But like as it's coming out, it seems like the details are like they had a plan to kill police officers. Like it wasn't just like, you know, a vague notion. They were going to start killing police officers. And so it's just fascinating to me, because not only that, like if you want to understand of like why like I do sort of the stuff that I do as well, like in covering Rebel. So like Rebel News, they're big in Alberta, obviously, which is our more like conservative area of this country. They had reporters or like their team employees embedded with those truckers since the start of that blockade. And they were documenting all the things that they were doing. They're even making like a documentary out of it. And then, okay, once the police showed up to deal with the blockade, Rebel News crowdfunded lawyers for the people to negotiate with the RCMP. And now, with those lawyers that Rebel News hired to crowdfund for these truckers, those lawyers are now defending these people who were charged with the weapon stash as well as the conspiracy to murder. So it's like, and like these are bad groups, and like they feel very alt-right. So like the one main group, so on one of the vests there was the symbol. They're a group called Diagolon, and the idea is that they want to. It's very similar. Have you ever heard of like Kekistan?
Yes.
Is very similar to that in that like they created a fake country, or like their idea of what like their like pretend white nationalist country would be. And the idea they had was they were going to say everything from like Alaska down to Florida, including the like Canadian prairies. Okay. And that was going to be the white nationalist state. And hence why it's called Diagolon, right? Like it's a diagonal.
Yeah.
North America there. And they're very right-wing extremist. So one of their slogans or like things that they like to say is "by gun or by rope." And you might notice the by rope there is very reminiscent of the Turner Diaries, which is
dear Lord.
Day of the Rope, which is this idea where the white people will raise up and hang all the race traitors, the people who were traitors against the white race. This book, again, inspired people like Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Oklahoma City bomb. Like, so these people are deep within the like neo-Nazi white nationalist culture, and they're being defended by lawyers that Rebel News hired, and were found with a stash of guns as they wanted to kill cops. So
it kind of goes
feel like the Oath Keepers and
yes, it absolutely does. And the other thing is, you've got people who are like connected to other major organizations in the United States, like Leah Dundas, who is like a Scientologist lawyer, were trying to create their own version of this rally. And there are almost inevitably going to be far-right neo-Nazi elements within this rally if it ever occurs properly. But also, like, it goes back to that interconnection between people who have connections to government, leave government, use their cushy jobs, fund these news outlets that then in turn fund neo-Nazis. So there's this almost cyclical element of cash that just goes into accelerating, almost like marketing, the far right. And that's really disturbing because it means they can sustain themselves if they're not forced to face some consequences.
Well, even the creation of the alt-right was like a new way of marketing far-right fascism to America. Like even the communications between Steve Bannon and Milo when like they were writing for Breitbart, like Milo made the connection between like gamers issues and against feminism and stuff like this and was writing articles about it and getting paid to do so while they were like, there was this one article written by, I can't remember his name. Oh, it's going to drive me nuts. It was written by someone who Milo then took all the credit for it. But the idea was they took ideas from neo-reactionary type people and far-right fascists, and they wrote an article basically laundering those ideas to the public in Breitbart without like explicitly being like, we're referring to ideas held by like, like legit fascist people. Okay.
Yeah.
And they laundered that to the public, and they did so like at the explicit, like there's a huge BuzzFeed article that goes through this, like explicitly Bannon was coaching them how to write it, how to convince people that like sell them on the idea of fascism without like being too overt, right? Like they're starting to realize, if you're marching in the streets flying Nazi flags, no one's going to take you seriously, but you can like use the same ideas and appeal to people without being like, hooray, Hitler,
Yeah. It's actually kind of similar to how like Richard Spencer was kind of portrayed and in the media initially. He was like this dapper Nazi, is like what they kind of described him in. I think it was the New York Times that used the term dapper to describe his depiction. And like, yeah, they were acknowledging that he was a racist and a Nazi and he was dangerous, but they also failed in like giving credit to his stylistic approach. They inadvertently made him seem more intelligent and more interesting than he actually was, and that got him a lot of attention. And it's concerning because this isn't like even the first time with like Steve Bannon or the modern far right. They did this stuff back in Germany as well. I mean, they used Three Arrows did a good point about like how anti-immigrant commentary in the United States is very similar to the way in which neo-Nazis and the German far right, even before the NSDAP came to power, talked about people escaping basically like camps in Russia. How they downplayed their humanity and how the debate around that is used as just both sides, when in reality there's a biological determinism and racialization that goes on. And it's hard to pull the veil off of these things, especially when I think that marketplace of idea thought process continues, because you've got these people who are like, I want to hear everybody's opinion, instead of just saying, no, you convince me. If you're going to make the argument, convince me. I feel like a lot of people
Yeah,
just
but
need to say, oh, go ahead.
the problem is people are too emotionally laden. Like that's the thing about the reason why the marketplace of ideas notion is wrong, is that like I wish we were like rational beings that just like sit here like computers and you give me a logical argument and I'm like, oh, Connor, this computes. You have changed my mind. But we're not like that. We're emotionally valent, right? So it's like,
Just type up the argument into Excel and just be like, there it is. Yep, that's correct.
like these people, I feel like a lot of the people who joined the trucker convoy, like again, the reason why I described it is like people who like they miss the world in which people weren't wearing masks. Like that's all that. It's an emotional thing. Things feel different and I'm upset. Like they didn't think their way into this using some sort of like rational process. They just like, I don't like this. and that's the thing where it's like, you have to realize as well that like fascism is always going to be around, or like at least the impulses that lead to fascism are always going to be a part of humanity. Like I don't think there's something that we can do that just flushes out of them. Like the only thing we can do is change the social circumstances or change the material conditions of people, which is why I propose things like, blocking certain internet sites or things like this, right? Because that's the only way to like indirectly affect their opinion, by having it so that someone who would be more likely to join a fascist movement just never gets exposed to the shit in the first place,
Yeah.
Sorry if I swore there. I don't know if
No, it's fine. It's fine. Like I've had Rico on this show. You've seen how he
true.
talks.
I
Not
just
calling
couldn't
out
remember.
Rico
I
or
also
anything.
just yeah.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
And but like I just since this is wrapping up a bit, I was just wondering if you had any last minute thoughts or things you'd like to say to people who see these kind of movements and don't know what to make of them. How best do you think they should approach these movements, and how best do you think really the media should report on them in the future?
Uh yeah, so I would say build stronger communities. I think, I mean, like I appreciate, I wish government was better. I think like you might have a little bit more faith in government than I do currently.
I don't have faith in government. I think I don't have faith in government so much. It's more like I demand results. That's my attitude.
Yeah, I'm more of the opinion that the system isn't amenable to it. Like what we need to do is build structures outside of government, build communities, and build solidarity that way. I do wish the government was better at doing things. And like I'm not saying this to say don't vote or anything like that. I'm just saying that the way to build a better society right now is to form community bonds and make sure that you're there for people in your local community and can help out. And that is one way of dealing with this stuff, especially when convoys want to come around and harass marginalized communities in your area. So that's one thing to do. As for the media and how they can cover it, I think that's difficult. I got really frustrated when it came to the trucker thing, especially when it came to like certain aspects of like left-wing media in America commenting on
Mm-hmm.
what was happening in Canada, in part just because like a lot of the knowledge that say I have, and like I'm not perfect, I'm a schlub like everyone else, but like part of the knowledge that I have about this is because I have the experience, because like it's happening right here. You know, I see it. I've been like documenting it as like I document the people who largely were involved in this thing. You know, so it's. I get frustrated when some American leftists think that they know what's going on here without even like talking to us. Like that's the other thing. Like I have nothing against. I talk about a lot of things that I don't have direct experience, but I try to understand it through other people in those areas who are writing on these issues, right? Rather than just assuming that me as Canadian, I just know everything that's happening around the world, which is partly actually why like I find it very difficult to say anything about what's happening in Ukraine and try to avoid as much as that is possible. Because like as much like basically all I could do is be supportive, but like I don't know. I'm not on the ground. I don't know what the general Ukrainian is feeling at any moment of time, you know, pre-war or after war. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
it's just learning to try to have like some sort of humility. I guess that would be what I would ask of the media aspect of that. I had one
Well,
other thing I wanted to add, and now I can't think of what it was.
oh, I
I
hate
rambled too
that.
long.
Hey, I've done that before. I did it a couple times during this interview. But I want to thank you again for joining me. You're always welcome on the show. It's always wonderful having conversations with you. And if any last words for the chat,
I remembered what it is. If you want me
go right
to
ahead. Go right
fill it in.
ahead.
So, and it also has to do with two cars in the chat said, I think ironically, what will stop these conspiracy right-wing movements / gatherings in the U.S. is that they believe it's a big conspiratorial trap. It's partly why the American convoy never wanted to enter D.C. So there's a part truth in here, and I do want to say like this is an ongoing sort of like trope that like a lot of like leftists have, which is that like leftists are the ones who are always infighting with each other, and we would just somehow be better if like the right wing we could all get along. But I want to highlight like what Two Cars is highlighting here is actually that isn't the case. Right wing people are just as like prone to schisms as all of us are, and in fact, like I want to even say it's like worse. Like getting back to like how we started this thing about the gilets jaunes and so when they were first getting going in the Canadian context, there was so I told you how they were going outside of our city hall and they were protesting. Uh, there was also another group that was in town that would also protest out in front of City Hall, and their name was Pegida. This is a weird, just Canadian thing. So Pegida is a German group. They're called People Against the Islamization of the West. They're a virulently anti-Islamophobic or anti-Islam group. They're Islamophobic, and so they would have these Pegida signs out front of our city hall and like a speaker that they would like complain about Sharia law. And they kind of like had co-cause with the Yellow Vests, who also had that Islamophobia, right? But they didn't agree on everything. And so even locally, right, the Yellow Vests would go to City Hall and Pegida would go to City Hall. And then they would write blog posts about like, they took our street. We were here first, and like I wanted to speak in the microphone, but they wouldn't let me. Why do they bring a sound system and they yell over top of me? And part of it is like the right wing people are just as like I don't know, prone to fight with each other, and in many ways they're more silly at it. Like,
Yeah.
like at least I feel when the left wing fights, it's over tactics or like specific things, but they're fighting over like who gets to hold the mic, you know?
Yeah. So in a way, just remember your enemy isn't as smart as you think they are.
No. And so like, but the thing is like the other end of it is you can't solely have that be the thing. But like, I guess there is some comfort in knowing that they are a bunch of buffoons. Okay. Like that, I mean, granted, sometimes buffoons can stumble into something. I think America, as much as a lot of people on the left like to downplay what happened on January 6th. I worry that like January 6th was pretty close. Many things could have happened that day, and America would look totally different today.
Yep.
And so it's like, I would rather the buffoons not stumble themselves into a fascist dictatorship, you know? But it's at least comforting knowing that they are a bunch of buffoons. Buffoons we should take serious, but buffoons nonetheless.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you for joining me. This was a wonderful conversation, and I hope to see you again soon.
Goodbye.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jody as much as I enjoyed it. If you enjoyed, consider sharing this around on Twitter, Facebook, or wherever you find it. You can also find other versions of this same interview on my YouTube as well as my website, where I go into a little more detail about my thought process before I made this interview. If you want to check that out, you can find it at progressive-american.com. Thanks again for listening, and have a wonderful day.